Favorite list for strengthening the lower back: garage, gym, a friendly. So the main one would be prone back extensions, where you just lie on the ground, hands behind your head. It's like a reverse crunch, and you curl up backwards and hold that one. That's probably one of the favorites. And then the other one I really like is barbell rows from the hang, but try and get your back in an almost a stiff-legged deadlift position, so you're not. Some people kind of have a kind of 45-degree angle back, and a lot of flexion in their knees. But I'm talking about like really hang your shoulders over. It's like you're doing an RDL position and rowing from there. If you go super heavy with them, it's actually good for your lower back in terms of it needs to fight that isometric position. So it needs to fight staying static in the same position. So I really like those for those barbell rows, because it makes you kind of resist the downward momentum and hold that position, which is ultimately what you want to be doing with your lower back training, is static positions. And so resisting weights like that are very useful. And then I know Fitz enjoys good mornings, but I'm not a huge fan of good mornings.
Yeah.
Also, another thing to add to this: if I told you should do some RDLs, what would you be targeting with your RDLs?
Always hamstrings.
So, interesting little story on this, right? RDLs. So Niku Vlad again.
Interest me.
Niku Vlad again.
Yeah.
So he was in Jim Schmidt's gym. Jim Schmidt or Joe?
Schmidt.
So one of the Ironman writers in San Francisco, I think his gym was. He had Niku Vlad and Niku Vlad's coach over, who subsequently stayed in America actually to do some coaching.
Yeah.
And Niku Vlad started doing RDLs, and no one had ever seen them before. And someone was like, "What the fuck are you doing?"
Yeah.
And he was like, "These RDLs, these are for my back, for the clean." Yep.
Yeah, but is it the same way as in like, oh, you need to use your back more in the clean, but it's also like back, hamstrings, and glutes?
No, if you're doing RDLs the way they described them, in that it does get your lower back. So what he does is he does a pull from the floor. So it's the thing he emphasizes. So you do the same clean positions on the floor.
Yeah.
You don't lock out your extension, and then you hold that extension, and then you lean forward and backwards. So they're not.
Oh yeah, that would target your back a lot.
They're
more.
not for your hamstrings.
Yeah.
I think they're quite a poor exercise for your hamstrings in general.
If you were to pick that off a rack at hip height and walk back, and you get like super set up in that position, you can target your hamstrings like a motherfucker.
But that's not what the RDL was. So that originally wasn't what it was. So I'll actually post the link to that. I'll find it in a minute. But so the RDLs were originally for people's backs. So Niku obviously had a phenomenal clean.
Yeah.
So cleaned something at 235, probably at like 100. I think he cleaned jerk 240 in training. So they were another good one. I did them the way, if you try and focus on your lower back or your back for your clean, they actually are quite useful.
Next thing was, any thoughts or experience with the McGill Big Three for lower back pain? Stuart McGill is a phenomenal resource.
Unbelievable.
Like very like a leader in the area. If you want to read stuff with strength and conditioning or like biomechanics stuff, go and read Stuart McGill's stuff. He's very, very good. I like the McGill Big Three. I like almost everything he puts out. And I think he has a great way of explaining things.
The thing with the McGill Big Three is that when you're doing them, you need to be doing them consistently. So sometimes people will do them like once or twice a week. But his recommendation for the McGill Big Three is that you do them every day, regardless if you're injured or not. Another really interesting thing McGill has talked about is like CNS adaptation. He's talked about some really interesting stuff. It was only a few weeks ago I listened to it on Mark Bell's podcast.
Partly inherent, of course, but it's also the practice and the years that they've put into this. Then they express what we...
And he's talking about like neural stacking and how the best athletes have like the kind of the best neurological function or whatever. I'd love to try to get him on the podcast and talk about that.
I'd love to get him on the podcast.
I might try actually get him on him. We should try to do that because I think he might be open to it. Just talk about that in particular because I know he's the back guy, but I don't have a lot of interest in listening to people talk about injury rehab.
No.
Unless I have that right now.
Yeah.
But in general, it's not something I've ever interest in.
Archer says, how to fit upper back tightness or unable to flex lumbar spine to get into a back stroke front squat position, trying to get an overweight friend to do some squats. If somebody is in a position where they're detrained, and so I wouldn't call it like flexion of the lumbar spine because it's not flexion, like that's a natural curve. So a neutral lumbar spine is slightly an extension. In this case, right, where somebody is so tight or so physically illiterate that they're not able to get underneath the barbell, then the barbell really isn't for them. And I would be starting with a med ball, a dumbbell, a kettlebell, an assisted squat. If everything is so restricted that just getting yourself kind of mentally organized or physically organized before you do the squat, then you really shouldn't be squatting, you know. And you'll get a much more bang for your buck from something else. There's a host of things that you can do, like a safety squat bar. You could do a front squat where they're not fully front racking the bar. They could be crossing over. They could be using 2 straps. But yeah, I wouldn't. If you have somebody who's like really, really, really uncomfortable with a bar in their back, I probably just wouldn't put a bar in their back. Okay,
just say.
Are pull-ups and chin-ups a good way to strengthen the upper back, mid-back for a heavier athlete? I can do 8 reps. It depends where you mean in your upper back. If you want lots of lat strength, definitely the pull-up variations are very, very good. Chin-ups don't target the back in the same way a pull-up will, you know, especially a pull-up with a wider grip. In particular, for strengthening the upper back, it's important to note that when you're doing a pull-up, you're obviously adducting your arms, but you're also internally rotating your shoulders. And most of us who have issues with our mid and upper back, in terms of like posturally, it's an issue of internally rotating our shoulders. So if I'm doing loads of pull-ups to try and get a stronger upper back, and then I'm then losing my posture because of that, I'm doing myself in 2 separate ways. What you need to think about with your upper back is, like, obviously it's a postural thing. So a lot of the stuff we need to be doing is externally rotating our shoulders, extending our mid and upper back. So things like seal rows, things like unsupported dumbbell cheater rows, unsupported pendlay rows. All of these things are going to be really, really good for getting a stronger mid and upper back. But it's important to note that the pull-up can be used, but the pull-up will also internally rotate our shoulders, which won't really help in terms of upper back strength per se.
Can we change seal rows to rows?
Oh!
And never tell
Like
anyone.
that.
Just never tell anyone either what's going on.